In October of 1933, about the same time Cachalot was being commissioned and Cuttlefish was being launched, the U.S. began its next class of submarine. This was the double-hulled Porpoise class, which is sometimes divided into two or even three subclasses: the 1,310 surfaced and 1,934 submerged ton Porpoise class, the 1,319 surfaced and 1,968 submerged ton Shark class, and the 1,350 surfaced and 1,997 submerged ton Perch class. I'm going to keep them all together and just run through the differences. Many sizes and roles have been tested in the Vs, but ultimately the role of medium-sized attack sub won out. Unencumbered by being overly large or chokingly small, this offered the best balance of habitability, fuel, equipment, supplies, and weapons capacity against speed, maneuverability, cost, weight per boat, and number of hulls. Remember, both weight per boat and total weight was now limited by treaty. The greatest advance over the Vs was technical. Air conditioning became standard with the last six, which made up the Perch class. The Mark I TDC was fitted in the control room. Another change was the use of welding. The 5 built in Navy yards were still riveted, but the 5 built by Electric Boat were all welded. The Navy would soon pick this up, and all future subs would be welded, so I won't bother restating this while going over future subs. The most important improvement was in the engine room. Most previous boats generally had 2 main engines and maybe a couple backups for recharging the batteries. These main engines were usually directly connected to the propeller shafts to drive the boat on the surface, called direct drive. When submerged, they used 2 separate electric motors powered by the batteries to turn the propellers. It sounds okay, except that, as you might have noticed, most engines were shoddy knockoffs of German ones, usually built by a subsidiary of Electric Boat. Please take note that the engines and the motors are separate pieces of equipment. The engines provide power while the motors actually physically turn the propellers. Tired of the repeatedly disappointing engines, the Navy turned to the only other industry with proven heavy diesels: the railroads. Eventually, they developed a new generation of engines made by Fairbanks Morse, FM, General Motors, GM, and Hooven Owens Rentschler, or HOR. At the same time, a smaller, high-speed motor tested on S-20 was accepted. Its smaller size, along with larger subs, meant 4 engines and 4 motors could now be carried. Not only could twice as many of each be fitted, but they allowed the Navy to fit them in a new way: electric drive. In electric drive, the engines don't directly drive the propellers on the surface. Instead, they drive generators which produce electricity to power the motors which turn the propellers. While this sounds needlessly complex, the redundant safety and options from disconnecting the engines from the drivetrain offset any disadvantages. For example, if one of the engines broke down, the others could continue to power the motors equally while it was being repaired. Or, if you need to recharge the batteries quickly, 3 engines could do that while the 4th powered the motors. If speed was necessary, all 4 could do that, and the batteries could be recharged by the auxiliary engines. In theory, electric drive meant the engines, like the batteries, didn't even need to be placed at the rear anymore. One could be placed at the bow, one midship, one at the stern, and one even in a waterproof box on the deck, if so desired. Obviously, this wasn't done. But what the Navy did do was put each of the 4 engines in its own engine room. This decreased the risk of all the engines being knocked out by a hit, the submarine equivalent of the unit principle. Post-war, other navies would adopt electric drive for their subs until nuclear power came along. Engines made by all 3 would continue to be found on U.S. subs throughout the war, even within a class. This reflected the industry trying to meet the demand for engines in not just submarines, but also destroyer escorts, merchant ships, landing craft, support ships, a variety of other types of ships, and of course, railroads. These were good boats, but not without their problems, most notably their engines. Being a new generation, they had mechanical problems. This would eventually be fixed with new engines, but the HORs especially would earn the easy nickname whores. The two boats of the Porpoise subclass, Porpoise and Pike, were built by the Navy between December 20th, 1933 and December 2nd, 1935. The two boats of the Shark subclass, Shark and Tarpon, were built by Electric Boat between October 24th, 1933 and March 12th, 1936. The 6 boats of the Perch subclass were built between February 25th, 1935 and June 12th, 1937. The first 3, Perch, Pickerel, and Permit, were built by Electric Boat. The last 3, Plunger, Pollock, and Pompano, were built by the Navy. Main armament was 4 forward and 2 aft 21-inch torpedo tubes for 16 torpedoes, 2 reloads for each of the forward tubes, and 1 for each of the rear. A single open-mount deck gun was fitted. Main propulsion was initially 4 diesels that generated 5,200 horsepower. GM engines were used in the Porpoise, Shark, and first 3 Perch subclasses. Fairbanks Morse engines were in the 4th and 5th Perch subclass boats, Plunger and Pollock. HOR engines were fitted in the last one, Pompano. Auxiliary power on the Porpoise and Shark subclasses was provided by 3 diesels that generated 300 horsepower. On the Perch subclass, this was changed to 2 diesels that developed 400 horsepower. These powered 4 motors that generated 2,084 horsepower on the Porpoise subclass, the Shark subclass, and Pompano. On the other 5 Perches, they powered 8 motors which generated 2,368 horsepower. This gave them a surface speed of about 19 knots and a submerged speed of about 8¼ knots. I haven't covered it, but since we're now getting into the subs that would see frontline service, I'll add submerged endurance. These subs could stay submerged for 12 hours at 5 knots or 36 hours at 2 knots. Test diving depth was still 250 feet. 2 major modifications were made. In 1942, 2 forward external torpedo tubes were added in the 8 surviving boats, one above and in front of the bow planes on each side. These were intended to give them more firepower, but they couldn't be reloaded or the torpedoes maintained at sea. The second major modification these boats received was re-engining. The ships originally fitted with General Motors engines received 4 new General Motors ones that produced 4,800 horsepower but were more reliable. The last 3 traded their Fairbanks Morse, or HORs in Pompano's case, engines for new Fairbanks Morse engines, which produced 5,460 horsepower. With the threat of war with Japan growing, in October of 1940, while the U.S. battleship fleet changed its home port from California to Hawaii, the first 7 Porpoises were forward deployed to the Philippines, along with several of the older S-class and the later Salmons and Sargos. They were all there when war abruptly came to the U.S. on December 7, 1941. The last 3 were based at Pearl at the time of the attack. Plunger was patrolling the waters around the harbor that morning, while Pollock and Pompano were returning from the west coast. Along with the S-boats and the Salmons and Sargos, the Porpoises based in the Philippines quickly shifted operating in the East Indies until they fell. They then joined their 3 Hawaii-based sisters, who had begun hunting the waters around the Japanese home islands shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Starting in late 1943, the survivors began transferring to the East Coast, where they spent the rest of the war as training subs before being decommissioned. 4 were sunk during the war. Shark was probably sunk by the gunfire of a Japanese destroyer February 11, 1942, in the Makassar Strait. Perch was scuttled March 3, 1942, off Java when Japanese cruisers and destroyers found her on the surface making repairs. Pickerel was probably sunk by a Japanese destroyer off Japan about April 7, 1943. Pompano probably sailed into a freshly laid minefield off Japan in mid-September 1943.